For decades, the modern imagination has been quietly shaped by a powerful but rarely examined myth, the myth of the Great Escape. Within this framework, the world is not perceived as something to cultivate, restore, or complete, but rather as a failing system, a collapsing environment from which humanity must ultimately flee. This narrative is deeply embedded in popular culture, particularly in Hollywood cinema, where apocalyptic storytelling consistently revolves around three dominant motifs: the destruction of the planet, the mass evacuation of humanity, and the portrayal of the universe as a hostile, indifferent expanse. Films such as Interstellar and Armageddon do more than entertain. They encode a philosophical assumption that is rarely questioned, that Earth is temporary and that survival depends on escape rather than restoration. Within this paradigm, the idea of redeeming the world is largely absent. Humanity is not tasked with healing its environment, but with abandoning it before its inevitable collapse. Yet when this narrative is placed alongside the latest scientific observations, particularly those made by the James Webb Space Telescope, a striking contrast begins to emerge, one that is not merely visual but deeply philosophical. Where Hollywood often presents a universe characterized by darkness, chaos, and decay, the images captured by James Webb reveal something entirely different: a cosmos of astonishing clarity, intricate structure, and profound coherence. Galaxies do not appear as scattered debris, but as organized, luminous systems with discernible patterns. Nebulae are not vague clouds, but highly structured regions of dynamic activity, rich with color and complexity. What we are witnessing is not a universe in ruins, but a universe that resembles an architectural achievement on a cosmic scale. This leads to a crucial reframing. The real universe exhibits properties of design, organization, and continuity. It behaves less like a collapsing structure and more like an evolving system of order. This shift in perspective compels a re-examination of another deeply ingrained image, that of a heaven above the clouds. In many traditional frameworks, the afterlife is imagined as an immaterial, indistinct realm, detached from physical reality and lacking concrete detail. It is often portrayed as serene but abstract, a place defined more by absence than by presence. However, when this image is compared with the observable universe, the contrast becomes difficult to ignore. The cosmos we can now see is not vague or ethereal. It is intensely detailed, vibrantly colored, and structurally sophisticated. The material world, at both microscopic and cosmic scales, displays a level of richness that far exceeds the simplicity of many traditional depictions of the world beyond. In this light, the conventional image of heaven begins to resemble a diminished reflection of reality, a conceptual reduction rather than an elevation. Instead of transcending material existence, it is possible that the fullness of reality is most clearly expressed through matter itself, not apart from it. From this realization emerges the need for a paradigm shift. The dominant framework, what might be described as a theology of abandonment, assumes that the world is ultimately disposable, a temporary stage that will be discarded. In contrast, an alternative framework begins to take shape, a philosophy of return and preservation, in which the universe is understood not as a failed project, but as an unfinished one. Within this emerging perspective, the central question is no longer, how do we escape the world, but rather, how do we participate in its restoration? This is not merely a philosophical reorientation, it finds resonance in contemporary scientific discoveries. One of the most provocative findings from the James Webb Space Telescope involves the observation of so-called impossible galaxies, structures that appear to have formed far earlier in cosmic history than existing models would predict. According to conventional cosmology, the formation of large, mature galaxies should require extended periods of gradual development. Yet James Webb has identified galaxies that exhibit advanced structural characteristics at unexpectedly early stages of the universe. This challenges the assumption of slow, linear evolution and suggests instead that the universe may possess an intrinsic tendency toward rapid organization and complexity. Rather than emerging reluctantly over vast timescales, structure appears to arise with surprising efficiency, as though the cosmos itself is predisposed toward formation. This observation invites a more nuanced understanding of entropy. Traditionally, entropy is interpreted as the governing principle of physical systems, a relentless drift toward disorder and equilibrium. However, the presence of highly organized systems within the universe indicates that this is only part of the story. Alongside entropy, there exist processes of organization, often referred to as negentropy, that enable the emergence and maintenance of complex structures. In biological systems, for example, life persists by creating local order even as total entropy increases. Similarly, in astrophysical contexts, matter coalesces into stars, galaxies, and larger structures through dynamic interactions. This suggests that the universe is not defined solely by decay, but by a tension between disintegration and integration, between randomness and structure. Within this dynamic balance, order is not an anomaly, it is a recurring outcome. From here, a more speculative but compelling question arises. Is entropy an absolute destiny or a conditional tendency? If the processes that generate order can be better understood, and perhaps extended, then the long-term trajectory of the universe may not be limited to inevitable thermal death. Instead, one could envision a future in which systems become increasingly capable of sustaining and regenerating complexity. In such a scenario, biological organisms might achieve higher levels of self-repair, and material degradation might no longer be irreversible. Concepts such as heat death or permanent cellular decay would no longer function as final endpoints, but as contingent outcomes within a broader spectrum of possibilities. When viewed through this lens, the universe begins to resemble not a system in decline, but a system in development. The patterns observed across cosmic scales reinforce this interpretation. Stars are born, evolve, and ultimately release their material back into the interstellar medium, where it contributes to the formation of new stars and planetary systems. Galaxies interact, merge, and reorganize, generating increasingly complex structures over time. This cyclical process bears a striking resemblance to biological growth, a form of cosmic maturation rather than deterioration. The universe, in this sense, behaves less like a machine running down and more like an ecosystem expanding in complexity. In light of these observations, the notion that humanity must ultimately escape the universe becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. The evidence points instead toward a reality that is not collapsing but unfolding, an environment that is not meant to be abandoned but engaged. Rather than existing as passive observers or temporary inhabitants, human beings may be participants in an ongoing process of cosmic development. The Great Escape narrative, once taken for granted, begins to give way to a different vision, not one of departure, but of involvement, not one of abandonment, but of restoration. Building on the recognition that the universe behaves less like a collapsing system and more like an evolving structure, a further inversion begins to take shape, one that moves not only across scales but also across responsibility. If earlier we shifted from the assumption of cosmic decay to the possibility of cosmic maturation, we must now follow that trajectory from the macrocosmic to the microcosmic, from distant galaxies to the immediate reality of Earth. The same patterns of formation, interaction, and renewal observed across vast astronomical distances invite reflection at the level of planetary life. Here, however, the contrast becomes more acute. While galaxies exhibit coherence and generative cycles, many of Earth's ecosystems bear the marks of disruption: deforestation, biodiversity collapse, atmospheric imbalance. The question that emerges is not merely descriptive, but ethical. If the universe tends towards structure and renewal, why does human activity so often accelerate fragmentation? This tension reveals something fundamental about human consciousness. Even amid widespread ecological degradation, there persists a deep and nearly universal longing for restoration. This longing is not reducible to nostalgia or survival instinct. It carries a structural resonance with the larger patterns of the universe. The desire to reforest landscapes, to regenerate soils, to restore oceans, and to rebuild ecological balance reflects an intuition that the world is not meant to remain in a degraded state. In this sense, human aspiration aligns, however imperfectly, with the broader dynamics of cosmic development. The movement from galaxies to ecosystems is not a descent in significance, but a localization of the same underlying principle: that reality, at every scale, is oriented toward coherence. Within this framework, recent observations from the James Webb Space Telescope take on an additional layer of meaning. Beyond imaging distant galaxies, the telescope has begun to characterize the atmospheres of exoplanets with unprecedented precision, identifying chemical signatures that suggest a wide range of environmental conditions. Some of these atmospheres exhibit combinations of gases that, under the right circumstances, could support complex chemistry or even lifelike processes. While such findings remain scientifically cautious and open to interpretation, they nonetheless point toward the existence of planetary conditions that approach what might be called near-optimal states. These are not perfect worlds, nor are they fully understood, but they function as conceptual prototypes, indications that the universe is capable of generating environments in which stability, complexity, and sustainability coexist. Interpreted philosophically, these exoplanetary atmospheres can be seen as a kind of cosmic map, not in the sense of providing destinations for escape, but in offering insight into what a fully realized planetary system might look like when not disrupted by collapse or imbalance. They suggest that the conditions necessary for flourishing are not accidental anomalies, but recurring possibilities embedded within the fabric of the universe itself. In this light, Earth's current ecological crises do not represent an inevitable endpoint, but a deviation from patterns that appear elsewhere in more balanced forms. The implication is subtle but profound. Restoration is not an artificial imposition on nature, but a return to its deeper tendencies. This leads naturally to a broader synthesis. Modern science increasingly reveals that the universe is not composed of isolated systems, but of deeply interconnected networks. Matter, energy, and biological processes are interwoven across scales, forming a continuum rather than a collection of discrete layers. stellar processes generate the anasa necessary for planetary formation. Planetary conditions enable chemical complexity. Chemical complexity gives rise to biological systems, and biological systems, in turn, influence planetary environments. This chain of interdependence suggests that local phenomena are never entirely local. They are expressions of a wider cosmic context. When viewed alongside ancient intuitions about a healed Earth, this scientific perspective does not negate those intuitions, but reframes them. What was once articulated in symbolic or theological language begins to find resonance in empirical observation. From this vantage point, restoration can no longer be understood as a purely localized or human-centered endeavor. It becomes a phenomenon with cosmic dimensions, a process that reflects the underlying coherence of the universe itself. To restore an ecosystem is not merely to correct a mistake, it is to realign with a pattern that extends far beyond Earth. The inversion is complete. Instead of imagining salvation as departure from the material world, it becomes conceivable as the transformation and completion of that world in continuity with the broader cosmos. This shift in perspective sets the stage for a more radical conceptual development, what might be termed somewhat provocatively a form of divine materialism. At first glance, this phrase appears contradictory, as traditional metaphysical frameworks often separate the divine from the material. Yet the accumulation of scientific observations invites a reconsideration of this divide. Deep space studies have revealed the presence of complex organic molecules within distant nebulae, structures that contain carbon-based compounds and other alchemiae building blocks associated with life. These molecules are not confined to planetary surfaces. They exist within the interstellar medium itself, suggesting that the ingredients of complexity are distributed throughout the cosmos. The implication of this observation is difficult to ignore. The universe does not treat matter as insignificant or disposable. On the contrary, it appears to invest heavily in the elaboration of material detail, from subatomic interactions to large-scale structures. If one entertains the possibility of a creative principle underlying this process, then that principle cannot be indifferent to matter. Instead, it would have to be intimately engaged with it, concerned not only with abstract forms or ultimate ends, but with the specific configurations of atoms, molecules, and systems. This gives rise to the concept of a material intimate creator, a hypothetical source of reality whose creativity is expressed not by transcending matter, but by saturating it with structure and potential. Within such a framework, the question of ultimate destiny takes on a different character. Two broad possibilities present themselves. One in which the universe is eventually erased and replaced, a total reset, and another in which it is progressively restored and completed. The former is simpler in a technical sense. It requires only the termination of one system and the initiation of another. The latter, however, is far more intricate. It involves the preservation, transformation, and integration of existing structures into higher levels of coherence. Restoration does not discard history, it incorporates it. It does not negate complexity, it refines and extends it. For this reason, restoration can be understood as the more sophisticated and meaningful outcome. It honors the continuity of existence while allowing for its transformation. In this context, the role of human creativity acquires a new significance. Artistic expression, scientific discovery, technological innovation, and constructive labor are no longer peripheral activities within a transient world. They become participatory acts within a larger process of cosmic development. Each act of creation, whether it involves composing music, designing infrastructure, or advancing knowledge, contributes, however incrementally, to the shaping of material reality. Human beings, in this sense, are not merely observers of the universe, but active participants in its unfolding. The concept of co-creation emerges naturally from this perspective. Humanity as a secondary but genuine agent within an ongoing creative process. This does not imply that all human activity is inherently aligned with restoration. Clearly, much of it is not. But it does suggest that the capacity for alignment exists, and that when human creativity is directed toward coherence, sustainability, and beauty, it resonates with the deeper tendencies of the universe. The implication is both empowering and demanding. It reframes human existence as meaningful within a vast cosmic context, while also imposing a responsibility to act in ways that support, rather than undermine, the processes of formation and renewal. Taken together, these reflections extend and deepen the inversion introduced earlier. The universe is no longer a prison to escape, nor a machine winding down, but a dynamic, interconnected, and materially rich reality in the process of becoming. Within it, restoration is not an anomaly, but a trajectory, and humanity, far from being destined for evacuation, may instead be called to participate in the completion of what has already begun. As the preceding sections have argued, the shift from a collapsing universe narrative to an evolving, restoration-oriented cosmos is not merely theoretical, it demands a corresponding transformation in how we live. If the universe is structured, interconnected, and oriented toward increasing complexity, then perception itself becomes a moral turning point. The images delivered by the James Webb Space Telescope are not just scientific data, they function as a perceptual recalibration. They train the human eye to see reality not as disposable, but as intricately formed and therefore inherently valuable. The critical transition, then, is from contemplation to action, or, if left untransformed, becomes passive admiration, but awe, when internalized, generates obligation. To see a universe saturated with structure and detail is to recognize that neglect, exploitation, or indifference toward the material world is no longer intellectually defensible. What begins as observation must culminate in responsibility. This transition gives rise to what can be described as a new ethical imperative, one that differs significantly from earlier frameworks, grounded primarily in fear. Environmental responsibility, for instance, has often been framed in terms of loss prevention. Act now, or everything will disappear. While such urgency has mobilized awareness, it remains psychologically tied to the same apocalyptic narrative it seeks to resist. Within the emerging paradigm, however, environmental stewardship is reinterpreted not as a desperate attempt to delay inevitable collapse, but as participation in a future that remains genuinely open. The natural world is not merely fragile, it is also resilient, capable of regeneration when aligned with its underlying processes. Therefore, preservation is no longer an act of fear, but an investment in continuity. It affirms that ecosystems are not temporary anomalies, but integral expressions of a universe inclined toward life-supporting complexity. This ethical expansion also extends beyond environmental concerns into the domain of social structures. If restoration is not localized but systemic, if it reflects the deep interconnectivity of matter, energy, and life, then social injustice cannot be treated as a separate or secondary issue. Inequality, exploitation, and systemic imbalance represent forms of fragmentation analogous to ecological degradation. To address them is not merely to correct human institutions, but to participate in a broader movement toward coherence. Social justice, in this sense, becomes inseparable from cosmic restoration. It reflects the same principle that systems function best when their internal relationships are ordered, balanced, and mutually sustaining. The ethical horizon expands from isolated acts of correction to a unified vision of repair across all domains of existence. Within this framework, even the most ordinary aspects of human life take on new significance. Work, often experienced as routine or burdensome, can be reinterpreted as a microcosm of creative activity. Every act of building, designing, organizing, or refining contributes, however modestly, to the ongoing formation of reality. This does not romanticize all labor. Rather, it reframes its potential. When aligned with principles of coherence, sustainability, and intentionality, daily work becomes a localized expression of the same processes observed at cosmic scales. Innovation is no longer merely functional, it becomes participatory. Beauty is no longer ornamental, it becomes indicative of alignment with deeper structures of order. In this sense, human activity mirrors the generative patterns of the universe itself. The concept of eternal creation is no longer abstract. It is instantiated in the continuity between cosmic formation and human craftsmanship. Such a reorientation also requires a decisive break from narratives built on fear. The apocalyptic imagination, while compelling, ultimately constrains human agency. It frames the future as a narrowing corridor leading toward inevitable collapse, within which action is reduced to survival strategy. By contrast, a restoration-based narrative expands the horizon of possibility. It does not deny risk or complexity, but it refuses to treat destruction as the final word. Instead, it posits that the dominant trajectory of reality is not termination, but transformation. This shift has profound psychological implications. Fear immobilizes or fragments attention. Hope, when grounded in evidence and reason, organizes it. A scientifically informed hope, one that draws from observable patterns of structure, resilience, and regeneration, provides a more stable foundation for sustained action than fear ever could. As we move toward a conclusion, the implications of this paradigm become increasingly clear. The future must be redefined, not as an endpoint characterized by collapse, but as a process oriented toward completion. This does not imply inevitability in a simplistic sense. Rather, it suggests directionality. The universe exhibits structure, and that structure evolves. It demonstrates continuity, and that continuity allows for increasing complexity. It reveals mechanisms of regeneration, and those mechanisms can be understood, supported, and extended. Taken together, these characteristics form the basis of a coherent argument. Reality is not indifferent to its own development. It is, in measurable ways, capable of sustaining and enhancing its own organization. From this synthesis emerges a call to action that is both intellectually grounded and existentially urgent. It calls for the abandonment of a purely apocalyptic mindset, not through denial but through replacement. the fear of total annihilation must give way to a disciplined form of hope, one that integrates scientific observation with philosophical reflection. This hope is not naive. It recognizes constraints, failures, and uncertainties, but it also recognizes patterns that suggest the possibility of restoration at multiple levels of reality. To adopt this perspective is to reorient not only belief but behavior. If these ideas resonate with you, if you find yourself rethinking the nature of the universe, the meaning of human action, and the future of the world, then consider continuing this exploration. Subscribing to the channel and following future content is not merely a procedural gesture. It is a way of participating in an ongoing inquiry. Each discussion, each analysis, each visual exploration builds upon the same central question. What does it mean to live in a universe that is not ending, but unfolding? By staying engaged, you become part of a community that is actively redefining that answer. Ultimately, the conclusion returns us to a simple but transformative assertion. Humanity is not called to abandon the world. The evidence, scientific, structural, and conceptual, points in another direction. We are called instead to restore it, to refine it, and to extend its creative trajectory. The universe is not a prison to escape, nor a temporary stage to outgrow. It is an unfinished reality, one that invites participation, and within that invitation lies both the responsibility and the possibility of continuing the work that has already begun.